His shrill, insistent ringing of Chief Richard Stanton's private line sliced through the oppressive afternoon humidity of the City Hall conference room, a discordant intrusion into the tense, ongoing budget negotiations with the mayor and city council. Heads turned, eyebrows arched. That line, a direct unlisted number, was sacrosanct, reserved for emergencies of the highest order, personal or professional, the kind that brooked no delay. Rick excused himself, a knot of instant, undefined dread tightening in his chest as he stepped into the blessedly cool, quiet corridor. The caller ID displayed Eleanor Stanton, home, his mother's number, at the Serene Meadows retirement community. But when he answered, his heart lurching, it wasn't his mother's calm, measured voice that greeted him. It was the frantic, panicked tones of Mrs. Martha Henderson, his mother's next-door neighbor and closest friend at Serene Meadows. Chief Stanton. Rick. "Oh, thank God you answered." Martha's voice was thin, breathless with terror. "It's your mother, Eleanor. She's fallen. Terribly. She's on the floor in her entryway. She can't get up. She's crying. I heard a terrible crash." "Oh, please, Rick. You have to come quickly. She's in so much pain." "I'm on my way, Martha." Rick said, his voice preternaturally calm, a practiced negotiator's mask, snapping into place despite the sudden icy fist that had just squeezed his heart, stealing his breath. "Have you called paramedics? Are they on their way?" Yes. I called them right away. They're en route, but Rick, there's something terribly wrong with her walker. It's stuck. She said it wouldn't move, and then she went down." His mother, Eleanor Stanton, a retired head librarian of 78, was a woman of quiet dignity, fierce independence, and a resilience forged by a long life, well lived, including nursing Rick's father through a protracted illness. After a complicated hip replacement 3 years prior, her sturdy four-wheeled walker had become her steadfast companion, her key to maintaining that cherished independence within the familiar, comfortable confines of her Serene Meadows apartment. It was an extension of her, a symbol of her refusal to surrender to age or infirmity, a tool she used with grace and without complaint. What could possibly be wrong with it? The dread in his chest tightened, morphing into a cold, sharp premonition. The 15-minute drive to Serene Meadows, made with judicious use of his official vehicle's emergency lights and siren, a use of privilege that always pricked at his conscience but was in this instance non-negotiable, felt like an eternity. Each red light, each slow-moving vehicle, was a fresh torment. He found the door to his mother's usually immaculate ground-floor apartment slightly ajar, Mrs. Henderson hovering anxiously in the hallway, her face pale, her hands twisting the fabric of her apron. Inside the scene was one of quiet, brutal devastation. His mother lay on the polished oak floor of her small entryway, her face ashen and contorted in agony, her breath coming in shallow, painful gasps that tore at Rick's composure. Her left leg was twisted at an unnatural, sickening angle. 2 paramedics were already there, skillfully, gently assessing her, their hushed professional tones a stark contrast to Eleanor's whimpering cries of pain. Chief Stanton, one of them, a young woman with kind, compassionate eyes, said softly, recognizing him immediately. "It looks like a severely fractured hip, possibly the femur as well. We need to stabilize and transport her immediately. She's in a lot of pain." Rick nodded, his throat tight. His gaze sweeping the small space, his investigator's mind automatically trying to reconstruct what had happened, even as his son's heart ached with a fierce protective agony. And then he saw it. His mother's walker. It stood a few feet away from where she had fallen, strangely, unnaturally immobile, almost anchored to the spot. He reached for it, intending to move it out of the paramedic's way, and his hand met unyielding resistance. He frowned, pushed harder. It didn't budge. It felt as if it were bolted to the floor. He knelt, his eyes tracing the gleaming aluminum legs of the walker down to its rubber-tipped ferrules, and then he saw them glinting cruelly under the soft light of the hallway sconce. Thick, ugly, industrial-grade nails, at least 3 inches long, brutally, crudely driven through each of the walker's 4 rubber tips, pinning the mobility aid, his mother's lifeline, directly, immovably to the hardwood floorboards of her own apartment. A wave of disbelief so profound it momentarily stole his breath and buckled his knees, washed over him quickly, followed by a surge of such cold, murderous rage that he felt his vision momentarily blur. This wasn't an accident. This was a booby trap, a deliberate, malicious, almost medieval act of unimaginable cruelty designed to inflict maximum pain, to disable, to terrorize. His mother had trusted her walker, had leaned on it for support, as she did 100 times a day, and it had been transformed into an instrument of her injury, a silent, metallic betrayer. The sheer premeditation, the calculated barbarity was staggering. "Martha," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, turning to Mrs. Henderson, who was wringing her hands, her face a mask of horrified distress. "Did you see anyone near Mom's apartment earlier today? Anyone who shouldn't have been here? Think carefully." Mrs. Henderson hesitated, her eyes darting nervously, almost fearfully, towards the apartment directly across the hall, the one belonging to Mrs. Gretchen Holloway, the imperious, universally disliked, and deeply feared president of the Serene Meadows Homeowners Association. "Well, Mrs. Holloway was agitated this morning, Chief. I saw her leaving your mother's apartment around 10, looking very stern. She was carrying a small canvas tool bag. I thought it was odd. Then later, she was complaining again about the hallway. She said Eleanor's walker was an obstruction, again, a tripping hazard. She's always complaining about it, about the clutter, about how it ruins the aesthetic integrity of our community." As if summoned by the mere mention of her name, the door to Mrs. Holloway's apartment opened, and she herself emerged impeccably dressed in a severe navy blue suit that seemed out of place in the relaxed atmosphere of Serene Meadows. Her silver hair was coiffed into a rigid, unyielding helmet, her expression one of thinly veiled, almost smug satisfaction as she surveyed the scene, the paramedics carefully maneuvering Eleanor onto a stretcher, is Henderson's tear-streaked face, Rick's own thunderous expression. "Oh dear," Gretchen Holloway said, her voice dripping with a false saccharine sympathy that made Rick's teeth ache. "Such an unfortunate tumble for poor Eleanor. One really must be more careful at her age, mustn't one? These old bones are so brittle." She paused, her gaze flicking with chilling, deliberate significance to the brutally immobilized walker, then back to Rick. "Perhaps," she added, a cruel little smile playing on her lips, "this will finally teach her a valuable lesson about keeping her cumbersome belongings in their proper place and not creating hazards for others in our beautifully maintained, unobstructed common areas. Order Chief Stanton is paramount for safety, wouldn't you agree?" Her eyes, small, hard, and glinting like chips of obsidian, met Rick's, and in their unrepentant depths, he saw not a hint of remorse, only a cold, cruel, undeniable triumph. He also saw something else, something that chilled him even more, a flicker of an old, deep-seated pain, quickly masked, but there nonetheless, as if his mother's suffering somehow validated a private grief of her own. This Rick Stanton knew with a certainty that settled like a stone in his gut was far more than an HOA dispute gone monstrously wrong. This was a calculated, vicious assault on a vulnerable elderly woman, and as chief of city police, he also knew with an equal chilling certainty that he was looking at his prime suspect, a woman whose carefully constructed facade of civic propriety concealed a deeply disturbed and dangerous individual. The setup for this act of barbaric cruelty had been a slow, insidious burn, a campaign of escalating petty tyrannies and psychological warfare waged by Gretchen Holloway against many of the frailer, more dependent residents of Serene Meadows, but with a particular, almost obsessive venom reserved for Eleanor Stanton. Serene Meadows, when Eleanor had first moved in a decade ago after the death of Rick's father, had been a genuinely pleasant, supportive community for active seniors. But since Gretchen Holloway, a wealthy, childless widow in her late 60s, with an almost pathological obsession for absolute order control and a sterile, lifeless version of perfection, had ruthlessly, cunningly engineered her election as HOA president. 2 years prior, a palpable chill had descended. Holloway, it was rumored, had lost her own husband to a lingering, debilitating illness years ago, an experience that, instead of fostering empathy, seemed to have curdled into a bitter resentment, a disdain for any sign of weakness or dependency in others. She saw frailty not as a human condition deserving of compassion, but as a personal failing and affront to her own rigid control. She had banned colorful flower pots from front porches, deeming them tacky and disorderly. Karen, She had instituted draconian rules about the precise placement of outdoor furniture, the exact length of lawn grass for those few units that still had small private patches, even the acceptable shades of window blinds. No garish earth tones. Her particular animosity seemed reserved for any visible sign of aging illness or disability. Wheelchairs were depressing eyesores that lower property values. Canes were dangerous clutter waiting to trip responsible residents. And walkers like Eleanor's were, in Holloway's frequently voiced and highly offensive opinion, ugly, noisy, metallic monstrosities that ruin the aesthetic harmony and create intolerable tripping hazards in our pristine hallways. She spoke of maintaining standards, but her pronouncements often carried the cruel undertone of someone purging perceived imperfections. Eleanor Stanton, a woman of immense grace, quiet intellect, and an unshakable sense of her own dignity, had never been one to suffer fools gladly, nor to bow to petty tyrants. She had on several occasions politely but firmly challenged Holloway's more outrageous pronouncements and discriminatory proposed bylaws at HOA meetings, defending not only her own rights, but those of her fellow residents who were too intimidated to speak for themselves. This Rick knew had made his mother a prime target for Holloway's vindictive ire, a symbol of defiance against her absolute rule. The inciting incident, the clear precursor to today's horror, had occurred just last week. Holloway had confronted Eleanor directly in the main community hallway, her voice shrill and accusatory, berating her for having left her walker momentarily unattended and disgracefully askew just outside her apartment door, while she had stepped back inside for a forgotten shopping list. Several other residents had witnessed the ugly scene. Holloway had publicly threatened to confiscate the offending apparatus as a clear and present safety hazard if it ever happened again, and had added with a sneer that made Mrs. Henderson visibly recoil. Honestly, Eleanor, some people are simply too feeble and disorganized to manage their own belongings properly. Perhaps it's time you considered a facility more suited to your declining capabilities before you become a genuine liability to us all. Joe, Eleanor, though shaken by the sheer venom of the attack, had stood her ground, telling Holloway calmly that her walker was essential for her mobility and that she would place it where she deemed safe and necessary within reason, and that she would not be bullied. The confrontation had ended with Holloway storming off her face, a mask of thwarted fury, muttering threats about enforcing compliance one way or another for the good of the community. But now, as he watched the ambulance carry his mother away, her face etched with a pain that was far more than just physical, Rick Stanton felt a cold, professional rage solidify within him, overlaying the raw grief of a son. This was not just personal. This was an affront to everything he stood for as a law enforcement officer. He would ensure that Gretchen Holloway faced the full, unmitigated consequences of her monstrous actions. He made a quick, urgent call to his most trusted homicide and major crimes captain Dave Miller, a man known for his meticulousness and unwavering integrity. "Dave," he set his voice tight, "I need you at Serene Meadows Retirement Community Apartment 2B forthwith. We have an aggravated assault on an elderly disabled victim. The victim is my mother. The scene is unusual, to say the least, and I have a prime suspect I want your best people on immediately. B." He then added the words, tasting like ash in his mouth. "And Dave, handle this one by the book, every dotted I and crossed a T. My involvement needs to be firewalled from the investigation itself, but handle it fast. This woman isn't going anywhere until your team talks to her." The conflict was already tearing at him, the chief who needed to maintain impartiality, and the son who craved swift, righteous vengeance. The rising action, the complex and often frustrating machinery of justice, beginning its slow, inexorable grind, commenced with Eleanor's emergency admission to City General Hospital. The diagnosis was as bad as Rick had feared: a severely fractured left hip, requiring immediate complex surgery involving pins and a partial replacement, and a hairline fracture to her femur. The orthopedic surgeon, a renowned specialist, was cautiously optimistic about her physical recovery, but warned Rick that for an elderly patient, such a traumatic injury and the subsequent long, arduous rehabilitation could often trigger a cascade of other health issues: pneumonia, blood clots, depression, and carried a significant risk of permanent loss of mobility and independence. The emotional trauma, the doctor added grimly, the fear of falling again, the violation of her personal safety in her own home, was often just as debilitating, if not more so. His mother, a fiercely independent woman who cherished her ability to care for herself, now faced the prospect of months, perhaps even years, of painful recovery and the very real possibility that she might never walk with the same confidence again, if at all. The image of her, once so vital, now so vulnerable, haunted Rick. He felt a profound, crushing guilt for not having seen this coming, for not having protected her better from Holloway's escalating malice. His wife, Sarah, tried to reassure him, but the guilt clung to him like a shroud. Rick, while ensuring his profound personal involvement, did not legally or ethically compromise the official police investigation, assigned Captain Dave Miller to personally lead the case. Miller, a seasoned, meticulous, and utterly incorruptible detective with an unmatched closure rate for violent crimes, understood the delicate balance required. Rick made it clear to Miller that he expected a thorough, by-the-book investigation, devoid of any hint of undue influence from the chief's office, but he also impressed upon him the urgency and the gravity of the situation. The full resources of the city police department, within legal and ethical bounds, were at Miller's disposal. Gretchen Holloway, when formally interviewed by Captain Miller and another detective later that afternoon in the plush, overstuffed, and unnervingly sterile formality of her own meticulously ordered apartment, was the very picture of shocked, aggrieved innocence. She feigned utter ignorance about the incident, then expressed performative, theatrical outrage at even being questioned, let alone suspected of such a heinous, unthinkable act. Choked. She suggested with a chilling lack of empathy that made Miller's skin crawl that Eleanor Stanton was notoriously clumsy and sadly prone to falls due to her advanced age and general decrepitude. Perhaps Holloway mused with a dismissive wave of her heavily bejeweled hand. Eleanor had simply become confused and had somehow imagined the walker was nailed down, or that she had tripped for other entirely unrelated reasons. These elderly people, she'd sighed, sometimes their minds play tricks on them. It's tragic, really. My own dear mother in her final years, she saw things that weren't there. It was a terrible burden watching her decline, knowing there was nothing I could do to halt the inevitable decay. The brief mention of her mother was delivered with a convincing tremor of sorrow, yet it felt disturbingly out of place, almost rehearsed, before she seamlessly transitioned back to her own victimhood. She then offered a vague, easily contradicted alibi, claiming to have been deeply engrossed in a charitable teleconference for the entirety of the morning coordinating aid for underprivileged children, a cause very dear to my heart. She was, Miller later reported to Rick, one of the coldest, most manipulative, and least credible individuals he had ever interviewed in his long career. But without direct forensic evidence, conclusively linking her to the nails or the act itself at that moment, and with no immediate eyewitnesses willing to come forward against the formidable, litigious Mrs. Holloway, Miller had no legal grounds to arrest her. She was, however, officially informed that she was a person of significant interest in an ongoing felony assault investigation. The second shocking event in this escalating suburban nightmare was Gretchen Holloway's immediate brazen and viciously retaliatory counteroffensive. This wasn't just denial. This was an aggressive, multi-pronged campaign of harassment and intimidation, clearly designed to silence Eleanor, permanently discredit Rick professionally, and paint herself as the innocent victim of a vindictive, power-abusing police chief and his troubled, attention-seeking, and perhaps mentally unstable mother. Within days of the incident, while Eleanor was still in critical condition, post-surgery fighting off a subsequent infection, official-looking HOA violation notices began appearing plastered on Eleanor's apartment door and sent by certified mail to her hospital room. The violations were ludicrous, almost surreal in their cruelty. Improperly secured flooring, resulting in structural damage to community property, a clear, twisted reference to the nail holes in Eleanor's entryway. Creation of a public nuisance through excessive and unwarranted emergency vehicle presence, disturbing the peace and tranquility of fellow residents. Failure to maintain property in a manner consistent with community aesthetic standards, presumably referring to the police crime scene tape that had briefly necessarily adorned Eleanor's doorway. Simultaneously, Holloway, with the full sycophantic support of her hand-picked HOA board, many of whom either shared her exclusionary views or benefited financially from her reign, convened an emergency HOA informational meeting. At this meeting, from which Rick was barred due to conflict of interest, Holloway delivered a masterful performance of victimhood, insinuating that she was being targeted by a powerful city official with a personal vendetta because of her unwavering commitment to upholding the rules and maintaining the high standards of Serene Meadows. She spoke vaguely but ominously of certain residents whose declining faculties and unfortunate personal circumstances are becoming a significant burden and potential liability to the community, and strongly suggested that Eleanor Stanton was perhaps no longer capable of independent living, and that her family, a clear jab at Rick, should explore more suitable supportive living arrangements for her own safety and the peace of mind of her neighbors. Big touching, she was with chilling efficiency attempting to gaslight an entire community to isolate Eleanor and to preemptively destroy Rick's credibility and the integrity of the police investigation. The local newspaper fed anonymous tips, likely originating from Holloway or her allies, even ran a small slanted piece, questioning the unusual police resources being dedicated to a simple domestic fall. Furthermore, Mrs. Henderson Eleanor's kind but timid next-door neighbor, who Rick was certain had seen or heard more than she had initially let on about Holloway's visit with the tool bag, suddenly became completely uncooperative, her eyes wide with a new palpable fear. When Rick gently pressed her, not as Chief Stanton, but as Eleanor's worried son, she confessed tearfully that Mrs. Holloway had paid her a visit the previous evening. Holloway hadn't overtly threatened her, Martha whispered, but had spoken at length about the tragic loneliness of old age, the unreliability of memory, and the dreadful consequences that could befall those who spread malicious gossip or misremembered events, especially when it involved important community figures. Holloway had also mentioned quite casually a recent increase in HOA fees for non-compliant units and the HOA's newly enhanced powers to enforce aesthetic violations. The threat, though veiled in polite language, was unmistakable. Holloway was actively, aggressively, and effectively intimidating potential witnesses, leveraging her HOA power to obstruct justice and silence any dissent. One evening, Rick found a small broken piece of his mother's favorite porcelain bird figurine, one he knew she kept on her entryway table, placed carefully on his own doorstep with no note. The message was clear: I can reach you. I can reach her. The midpoint twist. The critical game-changing breakthrough that began to systematically unravel Gretchen Holloway's carefully constructed, outwardly respectable facade of civic leadership and expose the festering, almost sociopathic malignancy beneath, came from a combination of meticulous, old-fashioned detective work by Captain Miller's team and a surprising, unexpected technological assist. Miller, frustrated by Holloway's wall of denial and the pervasive fear she had instilled in potential witnesses, had ordered a deep dive into Holloway's past, looking for any patterns of similar behavior, any prior complaints, any hint of what might motivate such extreme targeted cruelty. They discovered a trail of contentious HOA disputes in previous upscale communities where Holloway had lived, several involving allegations of harassment, petty vandalism, and abuse of power against elderly or disabled residents, though none had ever resulted in criminal charges usually settled out of court with hefty non-disclosure agreements. More significantly, they unearthed evidence that Holloway had in recent months been systematically trying to force out several older, less financially secure, or more medically needy residents from Serene Meadows, often through similar campaigns of escalating harassment and trumped-up HOA violations. Her apparent goal, investigators began to suspect, was to free up their desirable, often ground-floor units to sell to a more upscale, younger, and less burdensome demographic, possibly with a view to eventually selling the entire Serene Meadows property to a luxury retirement community developer, Elysian Fields Corp., with whom she had been seen having discreet, undisclosed meetings. Financial records subpoenaed by Miller's team revealed suspiciously timed consulting fees paid to Holloway by a shell corporation linked to Elysian Fields. Eleanor Stanton, being fiercely independent, well-liked, outspoken, and occupying a prime, easily accessible ground-floor unit, might have been seen by Holloway not just as an annoyance, but as a significant obstacle to her larger, more profitable, and deeply cynical plans. Her cruelty wasn't just personal, it was financially motivated. The technological break, the one that blew the case wide open, came from an unexpected source. Rick's nephew, Leo, his sister's tech-savvy teenage son, had as a birthday gift for Eleanor the previous year installed a small motion-activated nanny cam in her apartment, disguised as a decorative digital clock on her entryway table. It was intended primarily for Eleanor to see who was at her door without having to get up, and for the family to discreetly check in on her well-being. In the trauma and chaos of the initial incident, Rick had completely forgotten about it. It was only when Leo visiting his great-aunt in the hospital mentioned it, "Uncle Rick, did you check Grandma Ellie's doorkeeper cam?" that the memory clicked. Accessing the SD card, however, proved to be a new source of anxiety. Rick, accompanied by Miller, returned to Eleanor's sealed apartment. The digital clock was still on the entryway table, but it looked disturbed. Closer inspection revealed faint scratch marks around the SD card slot, as if someone had tried to pry it open. Holloway. She must have known about it, or suspected it. The card was still there, but when Miller's forensics team tried to access it, much of the data was corrupted, almost as if it had been exposed to a strong magnetic field or a botched deletion attempt. Hope dwindled. But one of Miller's young tech analysts, a genius with data recovery, worked tirelessly for 2 days, painstakingly reconstructing fragmented files. Finally, she managed to salvage a crucial, albeit slightly glitchy, 30-second video clip. The footage, though grainy and intermittently freezing, was explosive. It showed with chilling clarity Gretchen Holloway, her face a mask of cold, determined fury, entering Eleanor's apartment hallway, presumably with a master key she should not have possessed or used for such a purpose on the morning of the incident. She was carrying a small, distinctive canvas tool bag, the same one Mrs. Henderson had reported seeing. The camera captured her kneeling by the walker, her back mostly to the lens, but the glint of metal tools was visible. The sound of a hammer or a heavy-duty staple gun, sharp and distinct, was clearly audible, followed by her furtive, almost satisfied glance around before she quickly departed. The timestamp corresponded precisely with the time frame of the attack. They had her, cold. And on a recovered audio fragment, from just before the hammering, Holloway's voice, low and venomous, could be heard muttering, "Obstruction removed, permanently." The file also contained fragmented images from previous days, showing Holloway lingering near Eleanor's door, seemingly observing her routine, adding a horrifying layer of premeditated stalking to her crime. One recovered still frame even showed a handwritten list in Holloway's possession, with Eleanor's name at the top, marked with a red asterisk, and the chilling notation, "Priority, Aesthetic, and Compliance Rectification." The climax was set for an emergency specially convened community meeting at the Serene Meadows Clubhouse. The meeting had been demanded by an increasingly angry and fearful contingent of residents, now armed with snippets of information about Holloway's past actions and the horrifying premeditated nature of the attack on Eleanor Stanton, leaked perhaps strategically by sources close to the investigation to galvanize support. They were calling for Holloway's immediate impeachment from the HOA board and for full transparency regarding the HOA's finances and her clandestine dealings with Elysian Fields Corp. Gretchen Holloway, still supremely arrogant, still utterly convinced of her own untouchability, or perhaps simply too narcissistic to comprehend the depth of the animosity she had generated, had agreed to preside over the meeting. She intended, no doubt, to use it as a platform to once again denounce her critics play the victim and reassert her iron-fisted control, perhaps even push through a vote to formally censure Eleanor. She stood at the podium, a picture of aggrieved, martyred dignity, her voice dripping with false sincerity as she delivered a rambling, increasingly unhinged diatribe against ungrateful residents, meddling outsiders with personal vendettas, a clear reference to Rick and his police department, and the general decline of respect for authority and order in modern society. Fragentio. She even invoked her late mother again, speaking of the sacred duty to protect the vulnerable, while subtly implying that Eleanor, through her stubbornness and clutter, had become a danger to herself and others. Eleanor Stanton, still recovering in the hospital, but alert and fiercely determined to be present in spirit, had asked Rick to read a prepared statement on her behalf. It was a powerful, eloquent testament to her resilience, her belief in community, and her quiet defiance of bullying and intolerance. She spoke not of her pain, but of her hope for a serene Meadows, where dignity and compassion prevailed over petty rules and prejudice. She ended with a poignant quote from a beloved poem about enduring storms, her librarian's soul shining through. When Holloway finally disdainfully paused for breath after her self-serving monologue, Rick Stanton rose from his seat in the audience. He was there, he stated clearly, his voice resonating with quiet authority, not as the city police chief, a role he had temporarily delegated to his deputy for this specific meeting to avoid any appearance of impropriety, but as Eleanor Stanton's son to speak for his mother, who could not speak for herself, and as a concerned member of this community. His voice filled with a cold, controlled anger that was far more terrifying than any shouting could have been preceded to lay out the irrefutable case against Gretchen Holloway. He spoke of her escalating campaign of harassment, not just against his mother, but against multiple vulnerable residents. He described the brutal, premeditated nature of the attack on his mother's walker, an act of calculated cruelty designed to inflict maximum harm. He detailed the irrefutable forensic evidence from the nails and the staple gun which had since been recovered from Holloway's apartment during a warranted search, along with the chillingly detailed ledger listing her grievances against various residents and her plans for remedial action and the financial records linking her to Elysian Fields. Mrs. Henderson, finding her courage at last, stood up and corroborated seeing Holloway with the tool bag and hearing the hammering, her voice trembling but firm. Her testimony met with murmurs of support from other residents who had also suffered Holloway's tyrannies in silence. And then, with a final dramatic flourish, Rick signaled to Captain Miller, who with several uniformed officers and a technician with a portable projector was standing by at the edge of the crowded room. The lights in the clubhouse dimmed, and onto a large screen for all of Serene Meadows to see flashed the crystal-clear damning footage from the salvaged nanny cam video Gretchen Holloway caught in the act, her face a mask of cold malice as she brutally, methodically nailed Eleanor Stanton's walker to the floor. The recovered audio fragment, "Obstruction removed," permanently, echoed chillingly in the stunned silence. A collective, horrified gasp swept through the room. Gretchen Holloway stared at the screen, her face draining of all color, her mouth opening and closing like a landed fish, her carefully constructed world of lies, deceit, and petty tyranny utterly, irrevocably, and very publicly demolished. Cornered, exposed, and finally terrifyingly stripped of all her power and pretense, she unleashed a final vitriolic, almost incoherent tirade, screaming about ingrates, sabotage, the burden of caring for the weak, and how her actions were necessary for progress, for beauty, for order. It was a grotesque, self-incriminating confession, confirming her profound malice, her utter lack of remorse, and her deep-seated twisted disdain for the elderly, the disabled, and anyone who dared to defy her will. The falling action, in the stunned, ringing silence that followed Holloway's self-immolating outburst, and the damning video evidence, was swift, decisive, and almost anticlimactic. Captain Dave Miller, stepping forward with two uniformed officers, formally, calmly, and very publicly, placed Gretchen Holloway under arrest for felony assault with a deadly weapon, aggravated elder abuse, reckless endangerment, and obstruction of justice. Rick Stanton, watching as the woman who had tormented his mother and terrorized an entire community for years, was led away in handcuffs. Her face a mask of stunned, impotent fury, felt not triumph, but a profound, weary sense of relief and a deep, aching sorrow for the pain and fear she had inflicted on so many innocent people. He also felt a quiet release from the burden of his own guilt. He had done everything he could within the bounds of his office and his conscience. The community of Serene Meadows, in the aftermath of Holloway's arrest and the shocking revelations of her long-standing abuse of power and her corrupt dealings with Elysian Fields Corp., grappled with a difficult period of collective shame, anger, and ultimately profound institutional change. The remaining members of the HOA board, deeply compromised by their association with Holloway and their own past inaction or tacit approval, resigned en masse under immense pressure from the residents. An interim resident council, led by a newly emboldened Mrs. Henderson and several other respected community members, was immediately formed, tasked with overseeing a complete overhaul of the HOA's bylaws, finances, and leadership structure, with a new explicit emphasis on transparency, accountability, resident welfare, and the absolute prohibition of any form of harassment or discrimination. The proposed deal with Elysian Fields Corp. Was summarily rejected, and the developer implicated by Holloway's records found itself under intense scrutiny and facing potential legal action from the city. Eleanor Stanton, meanwhile, began her long, arduous, and often painful journey of rehabilitation. She was buoyed by the incredible, unexpected outpouring of support love and practical assistance from her Serene Meadows neighbors, many of whom had previously been too intimidated by Holloway to offer help or friendship. They organized meal deliveries, transportation to her physical therapy appointments, daily visits to read to her share stories, or simply keep her company. The cloud of fear that Holloway had cast over the community for so long had finally decisively lifted, replaced by a spirit of solidarity and mutual care. During one particularly difficult physio session, when Eleanor was close to tears with frustration and pain, Rick found her later quietly reading. She looked up, saw his concern, and patted his hand. "Richard," she said, her voice still weak, but her eyes clear. "Do you remember that old story I used to read you about? The little oak tree that bent in the storm but didn't break. Resilience isn't about never falling, my dear. It's about finding the strength to get back up, even if you need a little help from your friends and a very sturdy new walker." Her wisdom, as always, cut through his own anxieties, offering comfort and perspective. The resolution saw Gretchen Holloway after a lengthy, well-publicized trial in which the nanny cam footage, the financial records, and the damning testimony of her many victims played a central, irrefutable role, convicted on multiple felony counts. She was sentenced to a significant term in state prison, ensuring she would never again be in a position to abuse or terrorize vulnerable individuals. Her attempts to portray herself as a misunderstood victim of a witch hunt, led by a power-mad police chief, were met with derision by the court and the public. Serene Meadows, under its new compassionate and democratically elected resident leadership, underwent a genuine renaissance. New programs were implemented to support elderly and disabled residents, to foster a sense of true community and mutual respect, and to ensure that the rights and dignity of every individual were protected and celebrated. The aesthetic rules were relaxed. Colorful flower pots bloomed on porches, and the hallways, while still tidy, now occasionally featured a temporarily parked walker without fear of reprisal. Eleanor Stanton, after many challenging months of intensive physical therapy and unwavering determination, eventually returned to her apartment at Serene Meadows. Her spirit, though tested, was unbroken. She now used a new state-of-the-art lightweight walker, a gift from a consortium of local veterans groups, library associations, and community organizations who had been moved by her story and her quiet courage. She walked with a slight limp, a permanent reminder of her ordeal, but her eyes, when she greeted her neighbors, once again held their familiar sparkle of warmth, humor, and quiet strength. As a symbolic act of reclaiming her space and her voice, she organized a weekly story time for all ages in the newly renovated welcoming community clubhouse, reading tales of resilience, compassion, and the triumph of good over evil. Her gentle voice, a soothing balm to a community still healing. Rick Stanton, watching his mother some months later, presiding over her story time, her face animated as she read to a rapt audience of children. Their parents and her fellow Serene Meadows residents felt a profound sense of justice having been served, not just for his mother, but for all the vulnerable individuals whose lives had been diminished by Holloway's reign of petty cruelty. The sound of Eleanor's new walker, a softer, more modern click on the tiles as she moved around the clubhouse, was no longer a source of contention or fear, but a quiet, steady, reassuring rhythm. It was a symbol of her resilience, her cherished independence, and the enduring, triumphant power of decency, courage, and community over malice, greed, and tyranny. The peace of Serene Meadows was no longer the fragile, enforced, sterile silence of fear, but the vibrant, inclusive, and genuinely joyful harmony of a community that had confronted its own heart of darkness and had chosen definitively and collectively to embrace and fiercely protect the light.